Blinken's visit came less than a week after the UN said that it had solid evidence that Rwanda is supporting the March 23 movement rebel group active in the DRC. Rwanda has since disputed the findings, and Blinken had also visited South Africa and the DRC. In South Africa, he unveiled Washington's new strategy for sub-Saharan nations. The country's Minister for International Relations, Naledi Pandor, denounced what she says is an attempt by Western nations to force African nations to pick a side in recent conflicts, such as that between Russia and Ukraine. Well, we're now going to cross over to Professor Patrick Bond. He's a professor at the University of Johannesburg for more on that developing story. Professor Bond, thank you for joining us on the program, because Anthony Blinken's trip to followed Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's and is seen as rebooting of the Cold War choices for Africa. Now, does that reboot offer opportunities for African countries to reorient themselves to the multilateral system, particularly in the United States, in the United Nations, in the global economy, and in terms of their own needs for resources?
Well, that's the right question, because we don't really know yet what the United States will offer by way of carrots, because unfortunately for Blinken, the U.S. House of Representatives has been discussing and actually passed in this lower house of their Congress a bill that will increase the sanctions pressure on Russia by going aside from grain, but certainly for Russian oil, going after the buyers, including in Africa, including South Africa. And that was why Naledi Pandor, our foreign minister, has said this is bullying and she won't accept it. Now, Blinken was very suave. He's a diplomat of the sort of highest caliber, but he really can't get away from this schizophrenia in United States policy. And it is always to pose the one choice: free markets and free politics, democracy, and what we could call neoliberal economic policy, usually favoring Western corporates on the one hand. And what he would say is adhering to authoritarian, repressive policies, often associated with African countries that have leaned towards the BRICS, to China, to Russia, on the other hand. But yet Blinken himself is unfortunately coming to Africa just after Joe Biden was in both Israel and in Saudi Arabia, where the U.S. basically, even though 2 U.S. journalists were killed by those countries' leaders in recent years, very high-profile incidents. So the schizophrenia of saying we oppose that authoritarianism and human rights violations, and yet when in the Middle East it was very clear just last month that Joe Biden was absolutely fine with Israel and Saudi Arabia, it left the Anthony Blinken quite hollow. The Palestinian cause, in which the U.S. clearly sides with Israel, again, a point that Naledi Pandor raised. So if it is a tug of war, a choice, what African leaders and society must do is really sort out the rhetoric from the reality.
Well, Professor Bondo, is Blinken and the U.S. government potentially harming its own firms' trade, investment and finance relations with South Africa and the rest of the continent? And do they have any carrots aside from the potential sanction sticks?
Well, that is the right question, because, again, there's in the new policy and also in a G7 meeting a couple of years ago, and then late in June in southern Germany, where Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, invited South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, they have repeated the carrot of an infrastructure investment framework of about $600 billion per year that they're hoping will roll out in competition, especially with the Belt and Road of Beijing. Now, that's tricky because the Western firms really need profits. They really don't do much by way of donations, and they're not all that willing to write off debts, as we've been seeing. And that may be the kind of sticking point that prevents, for example, rollout of solar power. And what the U.S. has been doing, especially here in South Africa, is offering a just energy transition. In the case here, $8.5 billion from the U.S. and other Western powers, so that South Africa more rapidly phases out of coal. And yet there's so many contradictions. The money hasn't come. It was a big announcement last November in Glasgow, and they want to have it done by the time Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, in November this year, hosts the next United Nations Climate Summit. And so this is one of the most regrettable aspects for Africa, not just in South Sudan, but all over the continent. Here we had 500 people killed in flooding in April, and drought in parts of the Horn and all over the continent. The climate catastrophe is worsening. And when China and the US pull back from their deals because of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, that puts even more of a burden. And you add that to the high energy prices because of the Ukraine invasion by Russia. You add it to the food crisis, again, because Ukraine was a major provider of both grains and vegetable oil. Africa is really getting trampled by these elephants. And it does need to stand up more explicitly against, I think, both sides.
All right, Professor Patrick Bond joining us there from Johannesburg. Thank you.